Hello, I'm Charna Davis Wiese. Welcome to UCF Profiles. Some estimates say 1 or 2 out of every 1,000 babies born will be born with autism, a developmental disorder with very diverse symptoms. Please meet Dr. Mary Senne, and because of Dr. Senne, so many people with autism will get the treatment they need and deserve that wasn't available. I know I'm probably embarrassing you. That wasn't available before you put your mark on the university. Now, gotta admit, we're friends outside of this place, and we met at a football game because our boys play football together and basketball together, and we started talking about what we both do. And when I heard all that you've done, Mary, I thought, we've got to let people know that this is here at UCF and that this is available for people. Now, it started with a personal experience with your son.
It sure did, and thank you for inviting me. I think, I should have asked you to serve the hot dogs that day at the football game because you asked me so many times. I have 3 children, and my middle son, Patrick, who is now 18, has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And 15 years ago, it wasn't really a commonly known diagnosis. This topic nowadays is very timely. You mentioned the statistics. Even recently, CDC has come out with even 1 in 160 births those children will fall under the spectrum of autism. And so the difficulty that I experienced when my son was 2-3 years old was really finding a diagnosis. And my husband and I really were challenged here in Central Florida. There weren't the kind of specialists that we have nowadays in pediatric medicine. And so we spent a lot of time traveling the United States, went to Boston, California, Texas. And
how was he acting that you knew something was odd? Because the first 2 years, it's not necessarily noticeable.
Well, and that's in a sense, one of the greatest challenges in the diagnostic portion of autism spectrum disorder. The first 2 years, and fortunately, I had an older daughter, a 2.5-year-old daughter, who I really was kind of watching his development compared to hers, and nothing really showed up until about age 2. And I said, there still isn't language, and everything else really he was developing normally. And of course, my pediatrician said, don't overreact, boys talk late, those kinds of things.
Sometimes the second child.
Right, and call it mother's instinct, but I really began to ask some questions, both of the pediatricians and others. And at the time, I actually was working in psychiatric practice. My master's from the University of Central Florida really was in clinical psychology. So in a sense, I thought I knew, but I really didn't. And again, the diagnosis back then fell under what we also term developmental disorder or pervasive developmental disorder.
So in terms of that, and that time, that really meant we really don't know what it is.
Yeah, that was really that catch-all. That was sort of we know something's going on, but we don't really want to tell you.
to make the parents happy.
Yeah. And lots of specialists later, a year went by, and then
still wasn't talking?
Still wasn't talking, and we got terms like idiot savant, we got the usual mental retardation, we got all sorts of diagnoses. And we stumbled upon someone at Johns Hopkins, and it was a young resident, and she had come from Europe, and she really was the one that finally said, I really think it's autism.
You never heard of that, or had you heard of that?
I had heard of it, but
with your background.
With my background, but I didn't. It wasn't. I don't think I had paid attention in those developmental classes. When I was.
That wasn't
my
your
first time
interest
around.
at that time.
Yeah, my time. Yeah, and so I remember as a parent thinking, well, okay, we can handle this. And as I delved into it, I can see where even today professionals really are resistant to give that diagnosis because it is a lifelong diagnosis. It is something that isn't curable. It doesn't go away. It's something that with early intervention is very treatable, and there can be improvements. And I went on about to find out, how do I, in a sense, develop language for my son, because that was the key to really his world. And I talked to parents, I talked to other mothers, and again, back then we didn't have the internet. I certainly didn't know how to use a computer. And so I really went to the library and just started researching and came across some early studies that were done in the 60s and 70s, and everything pointed to communication. So I had to go about finding a communication avenue for my son. And that was really the beginning of what I called my home treatment for my son.
Being that there are so many people that go through this now, it must have been so hard to deal with that. Not only was it, oh my gosh, what does this mean in the long term for my child, at that point, people might not know what to do about it, but they can find places to help. You didn't have anywhere to go.
Well, and the recommendations back then, which, and it really was lack of research, lack of education, lack of understanding, but back then, almost every place that we went, both professionals, physicians, institutions, all recommended, long-term residential hospitalization. You take the child out of the home, et cetera, et cetera. And in some cases, even today, that's still, is a recommendation that I think, but it's a very personal decision. It's a very family-centered decision. And in our case, that wasn't an option. We said, no, this is our son. He stays with us. Now let's get about trying to figure out what to do. And through that, it was for me, it was very frustrating because as a psychologist, I knew what I wanted, but I couldn't find it. And so when we went around the country, I was looking at programs and I thought, well, this is interesting. There's pockets here and pockets there and different treatment modalities in different regions of the country. So I kept coming back here thinking, we're Orlando, why don't we have something like this? And so the challenge at that point, my son was about 5 or 6, and he had begun a few little expressive language words such as pumpkin. It was around Halloween. Mm-hmm. And so as a mom, I was ecstatic, and I thought, all right, now what? What can we do next? And one of the things that I had discovered along the way is that at the time we had centers in Florida called Centers for Autism-Related Disabilities, but we didn't have them at UCF. We had them at the University of Florida, and I believe at the time Miami. And so I went up to Florida and I said, why aren't we in Central Florida? And they said, Central Florida, well, there really isn't a university there. And I said, no, there really is. It's a great university, and why don't we try and have a center here? And that was met with a lot of opposition. It was met with a lot of, well, we can't do that here, we don't have the infrastructure, et cetera. And,
because even that short time ago, this was not the big university it is now.
And it wasn't, and even from the time that I had originally gotten my master's before I went back to do my doctorate, I remember driving in and it being a very small, almost dirt road sometimes in the orange groves, and then even going back to ask, is this something that you all would be interested in? And again, autism wasn't really a common household word like it is nowadays.
And it was probably so underdiagnosed, they probably felt that it didn't affect that many people. They didn't realize.
Well, and the other, in a sense, confusion for a lot of people is, does it fall under medicine? Does it fall under psychology? Does it fall under education? And what I was looking at is that ultimately it has to fall under education, because these youngsters, including my son, need to be educated. They need to be able to go into the public school system and to be fully included or partially included. And again, I was met with quite a bit of resistance because there really wasn't that kind of model set up here. And so my first contact with the university was really through two different colleges, and it was interesting that they all kind of said the same thing: autism, autism. So I did a lot of educating up front. And one of the deans in one of the colleges said, I think education makes sense. And I said, okay, I'll go over there and I'll plead with them. But meantime, what I realized is I needed to figure out how to fund it. How do we bring people together, talented people that know this diagnosis and know this population? And along the way, I'd met people that had worked around the state. And so I went to Tallahassee and met with senators, met with representatives.
Now this is all while you had a daughter and Patrick, and your youngest, Grant, was probably a baby at this time.
He was an infant.
Okay.
But you know what, you can put the car seat in the back and go to Tallahassee.
Baby in the bucket.
Yeah.
But you were on a mission.
I was on a mission. On the one hand, my husband and I really were blessed. We had a lot of family support. We had the financial wherewithal. We had the knowledge. We had the understanding. We had a lot of things that most families that I was meeting in the community didn't. I was meeting a lot of single moms with 2, 3, 4-year-old infants or young children.
The statistics are sometimes it breaks up a marriage.
One statistic which came out about 3 years ago is over 85% of families that face this diagnosis end in a divorce. It's a complicated disorder. It's a strenuous disorder. It puts a great deal of stress on a family.
Maybe we should tell the people who are watching who may not be aware what what it is, and it can be from one end of the spectrum to the other. They think of the movie Rain Man, but that's probably the slightest percentage of people with autism.
And that's a good question, and spectrum really is the key word there. Autism as a diagnosis really covers, in a sense, a wide range of people, such as what we call high functioning. Rain Man, the character in that movie, is what we would call high functioning, and then in today's sort of colloquial word, we use the word Asperger's syndrome.
That's like in Boston Legal, the TV show.
Yes,
There's the
that's
lawyer that they say has that.
And then can go to the other end of the spectrum where you have a significant impairment in all core areas of autism. It can be in communication, it can be in social, emotional, it can be even in cognition. And so there's a range of within that disability. And the challenge when youngsters are early is in that diagnosis, you have such variability in developmental. And you know this as a mom, each of your children develop differently or at uneven paces. And so you're looking at a child at 18 months and 2 years, 2.5 years. And if only one or two of those items or issues that are not showing up or showing up to excess, you're thinking, well, could it be this, could it be that? A lot of press lately talks about the overdiagnosis. And really two things have happened. One is research has improved a great deal and a lot more funding both nationally and locally has gone to it. And then secondly, what's going on is that the diagnosis itself expanded several years ago with what we use now to diagnose is called the DSM-4. And so with that expansion, we've seen in a sense, the numbers increase, but there is sort of the epidemic that has been talked about. And for me as an educator of special ed teachers, my role and what I see is these teachers are in there every day with multiple students with multiple symptomologies all falling under autism. And what is a challenge for them as educators, as I was dealing with as a parent, is in a sense, what do you go after? What do you begin to work at? What do you look at? What do you do? And so autism is really a complicated disability, and I think the more education, one of the things that our CARD Center does, Center for Autism-Related Disabilities, is simply that, educate parents.
And that's, even from one day to the next, the same child can be different, can't they? And display different, have frustrations. There's a lot of communication problems and social problems. So I've heard that some days they could be much more frustrated, and have a much more difficult day than the day before.
Well, and the way I can answer that, my frame of reference using my son Patrick now, again even at 18, the variability not just from day to day, but even hour to hour. There's a lot of unpredictability. And so just when you think either as a parent or as a therapist or as a teacher, oh, okay, I'm going to do this kind of monitoring, I'm going to do this kind of direct instruction, and all of a sudden you have the student just, in a sense, totally shift on you into sort of a different kind of child. And then you have to step back and regroup. So educating these youngsters is a tremendous challenge. It takes a lot of dedication and real commitment.
And thankfully you had that, and we'll talk a little bit more as soon as we get back. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Mary Senne, and Dr. Senne is solely responsible for the education of teachers who will help children and adults with autism here in Central Florida. Now, as we're talking about autism in general, some of the ways it exhibits social problems with even people like the characters you see on TV with Asperger's, where they have the guy on Boston Legal, he holds his hands a certain way, and he has a little bit of social problems. As far to the spectrum of child rocking, there was a child in the orthodontist office a couple of weeks ago, and he just poor thing. He just was very upset about being there, and I guess the way he dealt with it was he just rocked and rocked and rocked and rocked. And finally his mom gave him a stuffed animal, and he felt better. So you can be either end, like you say, of the spectrum, and that's how we can understand how difficult it is to train people to educate parents and educate these kids.
Well, and when you see those, and we refer to those as stereotypical kinds of behaviors or rigid behaviors, oftentimes it's a self-management. Hand flapping is a very common one that we see in younger children, and even some as they progress. The rocking routine. A lot of times we see that as children trying to sort of self-modulate. Their anxiety will go up.
It felt very, just even sitting there, he didn't know where he was, and he was very uncomfortable being there. That's what it felt like.
Right. Yeah. And, another real difficulty for youngsters, and I experience this every time my son has to get on the school bus, and even after all these years, we have a proximity to the next human being. We sort of know each other's space, so we know how not to get too close or to whatever. And youngsters diagnosed with autism really don't have that modulation. They don't really have that body distancing. And the best example I give to either new moms or teachers in the classroom is you almost envision, and this was shared with me when my son was young, if you open the door of a preschool and you let your preschooler walk in, they'll walk in and pick something up and sit down and start playing or coloring or whatever. My son, very untypically, we walked into a preschool setting when he was about 3, and he looked at the other side of the wall and walked through all the papers and the students and the crayons, and so there was almost a sense of absence of another human there. And that's not to say that children with autism, adults with autism, don't have a human connectedness. It means that the way that they exhibit that is very different. And if you go back 40, 50 years, when we first looked at autism as it was diagnosed, it was the refrigerator mom, and moms were not caring and loving, and that caused autism. And so you can kind of see where that originated. But what we know now is, again, it really is an orientation that our youngsters have to their world. And it's a self-monitoring mechanism kind of thing.
And there's no scientific proof that anything causes it. There's no idea where it comes from. Isn't that true?
Well, for me, what's exciting in education and what's exciting in research now is there's a tremendous amount of research going on, in a sense, to undo some of those original ideas of what autism and what causes it or whatever. The frustration is that we don't have an absolute, this is what caused it, and we certainly don't have a, this is what cures it. Autism is not a curable disability. It's not a curable disorder. It's something that can be managed, and it's something that can be intervened very early. One of the areas I'm not as involved with at this point, and most because my son is 18, is early intervention. And recently, this past week, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with some recommendations for screening, which of course I'm standing in front of the TV jumping up and down going, yay! So glad that this is happening. And I have a friend who's a pediatric surgeon, and I asked him, what do you think? And he said, it has to happen at 18 months, it has to happen at 24 months. And we're not looking at a diagnosis then, we're looking at, is there a suspicion of a diagnosis? And do we begin to intervene early? And I tell moms, I tell preschool teachers, I tell educators, whatever the deficit may be, that's what you begin to intervene with, whether it's language, whether it's social. But I also tell them, you must look to see what the treatment is, and is it a valid treatment? Is it based in research? Is there a scientific research behind?
There must be some things floating out there that are really may hurt more than help as well.
Well, there's in any newness. I think in anything that like this, we've seen historically, both in education and medicine, it takes quite a few years to really ground things, not just in science, but in practice. And I will tell you that I have more phone calls from parents who have said, I spent this amount of money, or I've done this, or I've done that, I've tried this, I've done this diet, I've done this, whatever. And I've asked them, how did you come about it? And there's a great deal of desperation those first few years. And my husband and I fell into that. And, we had a good, in a sense, the scientific background as his help in healthcare and me in mental health. But we fell into a few of those. You know,
Oh,
and I
it's
tried a
easy
couple
to.
things that I thought, what am I thinking?
I'm sure it's easy to, because you're desperate to find something to help, especially you at that time when there wasn't a lot of information available.
Well, and that was truly the impetus for trying to partner with the University of Central Florida, develop a center that was grounded not just in research, but grounded in something like a university that was well known, well respected, and that parents could freely access. And what's great now is we have this wonderful website. We have trainings in all of the 7 counties that we cover. It's absolutely free, and parents just come in droves, and we have, I think, well over 3,000 families now that we serve. Our funding is always an issue. It's always a challenge. You know, on occasion I'll go back to Tallahassee and
She's back.
and so I see where families come back now that have been able to utilize the center and say, you know, it really helped. You know, really, and I encourage all of my teachers. You know, I teach in the master's program, and I teach assessment of autism. I teach in the area of research in autism and educational research in autism, and I tell them, go over to the center and look to see how what we're researching and learning is being put into practice and how we're making that connection with our community. And I said, and go talk to those families, because sometimes the teachers are coming from school settings where the parents are pretty frustrated. And so the teachers oftentimes only have sort of that frustrated, angry parent. And I said, you need to balance that with parents like myself who've seen some tremendous growth in our own child, but it's really due to, you know, my son's had some fabulous teachers.
Well, the first one was you. You said that you had to go and start the early intervention by yourself at home. How did you find that? That was what you found in the library? You just found
Part
books
of it
in the
was what
library?
I found in the library.
Or just
and
what you figured out with your background, what could possibly help him?
That and I was, and again back then 15 years ago, computers weren't everywhere. And one of my sisters bought my son a computer and said maybe a computer because, you know, the visuals, and there was this old called Reader Rabbit. Remember the Reader Rabbit?
I remember Reader Rabbit.
Yeah, and copied off Reader Rabbit and cut those all up, all those pictures, and I created picture boards, and then I can picture what we now refer to as communication boards, and we traveled with those, and we walked around the house with those, and everything in my home was labeled, and everything had a picture, and so when my son wanted something or needed something, he would go to the picture board, pick it up, be able, and so I would reinforce him with whatever he was able to. And so that was really how we began our communication. And as he communicated, his frustration level came down. And that's a lot of the early parts of the diagnostic process, is really getting in there. And you don't have to have a firm diagnosis, but what you have to do is, how is this child working in his world? And how do you, as the mom or the dad or the preschool teacher, how do you make a connectedness with that child? And there are, you know, very specific ways to do that. But what I say to parents all the time is just do it and get help, partner with the experts. And, you know, finally what I say to parents especially, you are the experts. You know, if you really think there's something going on with your child, push that pediatrician and say, you know what, I think there's something here. It may not be autism, it may be something else, but a lot of times parents will go many years, and I tell them those are lost years of treatment. So be your child's strongest advocate.
And that's when they soak up the information so much in those very early years.
Oh, it's all of our brain studies, all of our brain research, you know, all indicates that. You know, as I tell my youngest now, my 13-year-old, your 13-year-old, the brain is pretty much done and cooked, so we have to stuff it all in. You know, so get in there and study your Latin, and that really is true for all. You know, obviously for all youngsters, but with youngsters with autism, and particularly language development. And more than about 50% of our diagnosed individuals with autism never develop expressive language, but they certainly have receptive language. And receptive language can be built as well as expressive language. So again, finding a way to communicate, finding a way for those youngsters to be able to be as included into the educational system and into the community at large as possible.
Patrick goes to school?
Mm-hmm. He goes to Winter Park High School, yeah. Yeah, he's in 4 or 5 general ed classes, and his 2 favorite classes are his computer class. He does not attend the lunchroom, but I tell any student, don't go to the lunchroom in a high school.
I don't want to go there.
You know, and it's not been an easy task. It's been a challenging endeavor to include him in the secondary level, and what I have found is it really isn't a resistance because they don't want the children. There's a resistance because they don't have the training, they don't have the knowledge. And when I was experiencing that when my son was in middle school, someone said, hey, why don't you go back and get your degree in
come teach us how to do this.
And I was like, no, I don't have time. So, you know, when I was saying to you earlier, it really was an accident that I fell back into to studying in the area of exceptional education. And my research area is preparing teachers to partner with parents. And when I first introduced that topic area for my dissertation to my defense committee, they were like, you want to do what? And I said, if you partner a parent and a teacher, I said, that child's potential for success is so great. And I said, but we don't do it very well. At least my experience had been it hadn't been done very well. And so that really is, in a sense, my co-mission is both to educate special educators, but also to teach them how to partner with children and their families.
Oh, it's so important because you have to educate the parents. In fact, Halloween, the trick-or-treating, a family came up to the door and this little boy was just adorable. And he was fine, and he was walking up with this little bag, and then my dog came to the door and his mother grabbed him and yelled, oh my God, it's a dog. He has autism. And he was really fine until, and I'm sure she meant it out of the best kindness of her heart in protecting him, but I saw his face, he was fine until she panicked. And then, of course, he wouldn't come to the door because, and I, you know, I'm sure she's educated, I'm sure she was just trying to protect her child, but all of these things we do as parents sometimes might not help, and we don't know.
Oh, and that's, and you know, as I always use that forest and the tree analogy with a lot of, not a lot, but I have a few friends, moms whose youngsters are all in high school now, and we talk about, in a sense, that variability from day to day, from hour to hour. And you know, one week they're afraid of the sprinkler or the dog, and then the next week, you know, they're afraid to go in their bedroom, and the next, and humor is a wonderful, I think, a wonderful sort of underpinning for moms that have gotten through that diagnostic part. We've gotten through a lot of the challenges of the school, and then you begin to support each other. And you know, and I have moms that call me a lot of time and go, you know, Mary, what should I do? What should I do? You know, you're the expert. I go, no, I said, I'm just the mom. You're the mom. You know, what do you do? And yeah, sometimes parents do. We do funny things.
In the best of intentions.
The best of intentions, yeah.
Dr. Mary Senne, thank you so much for all you've done and to help the people who are dealing with this in Central Florida. And thanks for joining us. And I have to say their names, Grant and John, both of them. They both had their names in. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again next time on UCF Profiles.